a frigid multitude of top secret, highly secure locations across South Texas, which is starting to thaw, thankfully. This is the latest edition of the Spurs Insider Podcast. I am your host, Mike Finger, with the usual crew of sports editor Nick Talbot and beat writers Tom Ringo Starr Orsborn and the polarizing Jeff McDonald. We're taping a couple of days after our usual Monday spot.
No pun intended on polarizing.
No
Did
pun
you say
intended
polarizing
on
or polarizing?
Both apply. We're taping on Wednesday, a couple days after our usual time slot. I'm not sure if podcasts have time slots, but we needed to thaw out and get power. And if we would have taped Monday morning, as usual, we would have been talking about the red-hot San Antonio Spurs starting their rodeo road trip with a couple of wins and vaulting to 5 games over 500 and looking like playoff contenders, and we would have had all kinds of stuff like that to talk about. Instead, we're talking about a team that has, according to the NBA, 4 positive COVID tests, now 4 games postponed on this trip. No games will be played until, I believe, next Wednesday, the 24th at the earliest. Tom, can you give us an update as to what we should be thinking about now? What are the next issues facing this team, facing this quarantine?
Yeah, Mike, as far as we know, they're still in Charlotte, at the hotel in Charlotte. And, I think they're waiting for guidance from the league on whether the players that the people that are healthy, that aren't infected with COVID, that didn't test positive, whether they can come back to San Antonio. The players, the coaching staff, the support staff. It's going to be a long stretch, potentially 2 weeks, where the ones that tested positive will have to be quarantined. So the other guys, you would think the best thing for them would be to get back to San Antonio, have some semblance of normalcy, and also be able to stay in shape for whenever they do play again, which would be February 24th at Oklahoma City if everything goes well.
And this is not the Spurs' first brush with COVID this year. Drew Eubanks and Becky Hammon had it in Los Angeles. And to your point, Tom, they were there for a couple of weeks, right?
Yes,
10 days.
Nearly 2 weeks. Yeah, 10 days, yeah.
10 days. So do you guys want to get into that, or kind of how this – I know there's to keep this in perspective, there are things bigger than basketball, a lot of things bigger than basketball these days. But, this is a podcast about the local Cagers. How does this kind of affect their season? What would you think, Jeff?
Well, first of all, we'll see if they return to the floor on the 24th. But really, if it's only we don't really know what the positive test situation is, what other positive tests there may or may not be. But if it's only the four right now, then that once the contact tracing protocols are followed, that could leave them, ready to play. I mean, not ready to play, but forced to play. If they only have 4 guys with positive tests, that's going to leave them with 12 that don't. I mean, even if you count the guys in the bubble, that's 10 that don't. So that's a go. But we don't know who they will have for that game at Oklahoma City if they're allowed to play. I think that's still within the window where the people, the 4 players that have the positive test won't be able to play. So they'll be shorthanded, and we won't even really know what their rotation might even look like. What if it's all the bigs? Like we don't know what the team will even look like. But there's a real possibility that they could go from red hot to having a week or so off, 8 days, 9 days off, to returning with a skeleton crew and not really being able to regain that momentum, that footing that they had. So it's just another challenge, and other teams have had to go through it, so you can't really complain about it. But it did seem right as the Spurs were getting everyone back, getting that young core back, Derek White's back, everything's back kind of where it needs to be. All of a sudden they have to take this forced break.
And then we don't know Aldridge's status. So conceivably, he should be okay by the time they return,
Yeah,
but we
one
really
thing
don't
to
know.
consider of when they're coming back is what do they come back like?
Right. And I mean,
Well,
it's not
how do
just
we
a
know that
matter
anyone's going to be
of
okay when they return? We got 4 players with COVID. That's going to be like Jason Tatum or Karl Anthony Towns or a couple other players have really struggled with it when they returned. Tatum said the other day that he's still struggling to get up and down the court. We don't know which players have it at this point. So, I mean, if there's DeJounte Murray and DeMar DeRozan and some of your core that have it, it could really hinder the team going forward. You just don't – there's a lot of unknowns with how it's going to affect who has it, and we don't really know who has it because those won't be confirmed at this point, right? So –
Just let me read, just so we are all clear, our listener is clear. This is from the NBA website. This is the protocol for returning to play. I'll just read it. Anyone who tests positive will have 2 routes to returning to work. They can either go 10 days or more after the first positive test, so a 10-day quarantine, first positive test or onset of symptoms, or they can test negative twice at least 24 hours apart via PCR testing. So that's there's 2 routes to do it. You're either out for 10 days or you get 2 negative tests, PCR tests within 24 hours of each other. So,
right.
There you go.
And I mean, to Nick's point, we're talking about almost 2 different issues within the COVID, and that on one hand, it's when are players allowed to return, and then on the other, we're still talking about a virus and a disease that can have impacts that we can't know for sure who's going to have these lingering Jason Tatum like symptoms. That, I mean, you can't just assume that, okay, Quindary Weatherspoon had it, he's now recovered, all is well with Quindary Weatherspoon now. I mean, there could be issues that the players that are returning, once they are allowed to return, could face for a while. So it's a complicated thing. I don't think it's a matter of 1 week from now this is completely behind them. That definitely won't be the case because, like Jeff pointed out, those 4 people who tested positive aren't going to be back in 7 days. But this could be something that they'll have to deal with for a while. And, they are not the only team to deal with it. They're not the only people to be dealing with it, of course. But this, frustrating to say the least for the Spurs to hit their road trip this way. What were you guys thinking about the way everything was coming together, as of Sunday night in Charlotte, where they, I guess the first 2 games of the road trip, they build a 42-point lead at Atlanta and then erase a 17-point first quarter deficit against Charlotte, like in a matter of a few minutes. I mean, those in a way were 2 of the most impressive performances of the year, weren't they?
Yeah, and I guess the one thing you can say is this ensures they're going to have a winning rodeo road trip for the first time in 3 years, because they can't finish worse than 2-1. But yeah, right. It was really two impressive performances. To me, the big thing is Derek White being back in the lineup and back to looking more like himself. When that foursome, White and Murray and Keldon and Lonnie are all playing well together, the Spurs are really tough to beat. And we saw that in Charlotte, where Charlotte did some things to sort of take DeMar out of the mix. I think he had 8 points in that game, DeMar DeRozan. But the other 4 guys that I mentioned all played well, all gave you good minutes. And when that happens, the Spurs are a pretty good team. And you kind of start to see what they were envisioning when they were stacking all these draft picks up together in a row.
Yeah, they've really, they've won 5 of 6. They've got the backcourt that they want finally set. Lonnie, it's a small sample size, but he seems, the game that he had against Charlotte was a good sign that he could settle into that role coming off the bench. I mean, everything was looking up, and then bam, the COVID hits them pretty hard. So, Yeah, but everything was falling into place. Of course, Aldridge is out of the mix, and that's the big question mark: is what happens when he comes back.
We're kind of back to where we were at the beginning of the year, where they're coming out of that Orlando bubble and everything looks good. But what do we do about LaMarcus? And so we're sort of back to that when LaMarcus returns and everything's up and running again. How does he fit in? How do they do what they've been doing with him out? And that's kind of where we were when we came into the season.
There's not going to be games for a while, so this might be as good of a podcast as any to get into that, since there's not much to analyze in the immediate future. Why not look at long-term future and whether or not LaMarcus does fit? I think this is a year where, you're talking about the two high-profile veterans who are going to become free agents, and whether this will be their last year in San Antonio, whether they're going to move on. I think in a lot of ways, DeMar DeRozan has proven that he can be really valuable to a team with a young core to kind of be part of the winning, being part of distributing, being fitting right into that bubble ball the way he did even last summer. The questions about LaMarcus continue, and I guess two questions: how does he fit in the rest of this season? And I think the more obvious one is that he probably does not fit in beyond this season, right?
Yeah, I think your second question is correct, or your second statement is correct. The first one, it's not like he's a bad player, and he's had some games where he's done some good things for you. I just think when he's out there, this is something that I don't think, this is going to sound ridiculous if I had said it 2-3 years ago, but whenever LaMarcus Aldridge is out there, he's taking minutes away from Jakob Poeltl, and that's a bad thing. Like, that's a bad thing. And LaMarcus has had these moments when he's not making shots. LaMarcus isn't helping you very much anymore. I mean, is that fair or unfair?
Right.
There was a thing, like, I was looking at LaMarcus, he's not rebounding at all this year. Like, there are games where he has 1 or 2 rebounds, and I thought, well, that's just because, DeJounte Murray and Keldon Johnson are just attacking the boards and taking rebounds from the bigs. But here's 4 of the last 5 games from Jakob Poeltl on the boards: 11, 12, 11, 11. So it's not just that the guards are big and good rebounders. It's that LaMarcus doesn't rebound anymore. And I mean, he's 35. He's obviously been hobbled because he's on the shelf right now. He's a good shooter. That's what he is right now, and I think he still has value to that in that respect. But Jakob Poeltl does so many good things. It's hard to have him off the floor for too long.
I think the thing that Jeff's point is, I think Jakob Poeltl just fits better with what this team needs right now, especially with DeMar and how Keldon Johnson have come along, and how they're working on the floor together. You really need that big in the middle that's going to rebound and be a defensive rim presence. And that's not LaMarcus. That's Jakob Poeltl. And that's really what this team needs to be successful, I think. And that's what it showed on these last 6 games when they went 5-1 without him. They've done pretty well with him. I think they're 11-7 with LaMarcus in the lineup. But now, those last 6 games or so, they've kind of shown and found a groove where they've shown they don't. It sounds weird, but they don't need him to be successful this year.
I think the overall point that you guys are making is correct. But just to be devil's advocate a bit, it's not necessarily about LaMarcus Aldridge versus Jakob Poeltl. It's more. Well, it is in a starting lineup or in the majority of the minutes type of question. But I mean, would you rather have LaMarcus Aldridge 20 LaMarcus Aldridge minutes or 20 Drew Eubanks minutes? Because Poeltl's going to get 20 minutes either way. He might get extra with LaMarcus out, but to completely discount LaMarcus because you like what Poeltl gives you better doesn't necessarily mean you just scrap LaMarcus Aldridge.
I'm not saying just scrap him. But
the other thing, go ahead.
Poeltl has played 30 minutes in, what's that, 5, 6, 7 of the last 8 games. Or no, since LaMarcus has been out, he's played 30 minutes in all of them but one. The one is that one the loss at Golden State where they just got run off the floor. So every meaningful game, Hurdle's playing 30 minutes. If you want to give LaMarcus the Drew Eubanks minutes, that makes some sense to me, I guess. But we've also talked like you can't bring LaMarcus off the bench. If you're going to play him, he has to start. He just does.
I guess I'm just saying that it's a little more complex than just one or the other. The other thing is, as Nick pointed out, the Spurs are a winning team with LaMarcus playing. Their upside looks higher in these games when the younger core is just running wild and playing fun basketball, and it's more enjoyable to watch that style than watching LaMarcus kind of post up and slow things down. And I don't think LaMarcus is part of the long-term future. But to say that it's like this night and day thing where they're great without him and terrible with him, it's not that simple either. Because I think through the first month or so, the difference was pretty stark in terms of their winning percentage with LaMarcus was better than when he was sitting. So I think everybody's kind of on the same page here. LaMarcus has value. It's just a question of how he fits into this. And I don't think, COVID aside, because they might come to a point here where they need every live body they can get. Once all this is settled, I don't think anybody would think it's the worst thing ever if they kind of moved on from the Aldridge era.
You wonder too, is this how it's going to be for the rest of the season? He's, dating back to last year, the shoulder surgery. He had a knee issue that sidelined him for 3 games earlier. Then the hip, which conceivably, seemed like a minor thing. And then Pop said he's seeing his own doctor for treatment on that. And that's kind of lingered longer than I anticipated. Rudy Gay had the sore hip and missed 1 game. So you just wonder if he's at this, sadly at that point in his career where injuries are going to be an issue all the time.
Right. And then he comes back for 4 or 5 games and plays, and he's out of the lineup, and you're readjusting. You're constantly readjusting. Like, that's another thing to consider. Like, if you can't really count on him to be available for a 10-game stretch in a row, that reduces his value as well. Eventually, you have to put your team together with the notion that he's not going to be there, or he's probably not going to be there, or there's a good chance he's not going to be there. Pop is big on the team. Every coach is big on the team gelling. You want your lineups and your combinations to gel. And if you have one guy playing that plays, one key part of that rotation that's in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, it really makes it difficult for that process to happen. So we'll see. We'll have to see coming out of COVID how he looks, how he feels, whether he can stay on the floor for an extended period of time before we can really evaluate his fit or how he fits the rest of the season. But again, I think we're all on the same page that after this season, it's really hard to see how he fits into the long-term plans here.
With an expiring contract, is it worth even pursuing the March 25th trade deadline with LaMarcus Aldridge? I know some people have started drooling at the bit that they think they can actually get something for him at this point in his career. I'm not sure that's true, but is that something that Spurs should consider?
Jeff used the word value in what he was just talking about, and here's the issue. Now that the Spurs can see when you come to the conclusion that a guy no longer helps you, or that you'd rather be without him, other teams have probably reached the same conclusion about that player. So, okay, now let's say they decide their future is without LaMarcus Aldridge. They're willing to get rid of him. That means that his trade value is probably at an all-time low.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine you're going to get much more than a couple of second-round picks for him, but that's,
And then the problem is you got to take back salary to make it work.
And the way the trade market works is you can't just trade him for 2 second-round picks. You have to take all that salary back. Unless there's a team that's way under the cap can absorb them, and no one wants to do that. So
the only 2 teams, Finger, I think I believe can absorb them without the Spurs taking back any money on the contract would be the Boston Celtics and the New York Knicks. The Celtics have a trade exception from Gordon Hayward, and the Knicks are $17 million under the cap. Knicks, of course, you'd still have to take back $7 million.
The Knicks would totally trade for LaMarcus Aldridge. I think this is almost a done deal. They would totally. But they would totally trade for Aldridge.
But for like all the Spurs fans out there who are on the NBA trade machine, those are the only really things that kind of work. And I don't know if either of those could see either of those realistically happening. That was my point. I don't know if even those scenarios are not very realistic.
And again, LaMarcus being on the injured list all season off and on isn't helpful in that regard either.
Right. There's no realistic trade out there that I see. As it's one, like I said earlier, once the Spurs have decided that he can't help them or that they'd be better off without him, like why wouldn't you expect most other teams to reach that same conclusion? There seems to be no upside there for anybody. Like one trade partner that's been rumored for the past couple of years has always been Portland because the Dame LaMarcus relationship is supposedly thawing and that they'd like to be together again. And but I mean that doesn't really work either. Like, why does Portland want to trade for a couple of months of LaMarcus when, as Jeff points out, he's not healthy? It's just it's one thing to say, hey, it's time to trade LaMarcus. It's another thing to actually do it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So and okay, the inevitable criticism, the second guessing that comes along with this is, well, now they're going to let him go for nothing. Or how can you let this guy go and not get anything in return for him? It doesn't – taking back bad contracts is not necessarily better than letting him go and having this cap space. Like that's
it's demonstrably worse.
Right. So, but there's this line of thinking, he's going to be gone next year. Get something for him while you can. Like that is getting anything for him while you can. If that's like a bunch of overpaid guys who you fill out your roster with, that is worse than having $20 million of cap space this offseason. So
yeah, I don't want any contracts back for players that go beyond this season unless they're players I actually want on my roster beyond this season, which seems like an obvious thing to say. But a lot of times in trades like this, you'll have to take back a guy with 2 years left that you don't really want, but you have to take him back, make the math work. If I'm the Spurs in this rebuilding process, I don't want anybody on my books for next season that I don't want to actually be a part of this. I want Jakob Poeltl, I want DeJounte Murray, I want Derek White, all those guys that you signed to extensions beyond this year, but I don't want Flotsam and Jetsam from some other team, which I think those guys are from Latvia.
Can I just say that I'd realized that that part of this is shtick that you've been doing lately about how Jakob Poeltl is the greatest player on the team. But I love how committed you are to it, that when you're talking about when you talk about all the players that the Spurs want around for the future, the first one you mention is Jakob Poeltl. I think that's great. I think your commitment to this bit is not a bit outstanding.
He's like that guy. Like they need to. He should be the first player in Spurs history to have his jersey retired while he's playing. Put that thing in the rafters now. He's so much fun. I love him. I love watching him go to town. Like the rebounds and the blocks. It's great.
While we're talking about enjoyable stuff, and we've left Tom. I'm going to let Tom talk for a little bit. He's been quiet for far too long.
Well, not to write the farewell story for LaMarcus Aldridge, but it is if this season is the end for him in San Antonio. It's a tough deal. He came here to win a championship and and for personal reasons also with his family. But you go back to the Kawhi Leonard drama, and it just unraveled for him. And he had 2 All-Star appearances as a Spur, and it started off looking really, really like it was really going to be what he had hoped for. So it's just kind of a sad ending if it is the ending. And what a great career he's had.
And really was like he was what they thought he was.
Yeah. just circumstances.
The team came unraveled around him.
Right.
Exactly.
And I don't think anybody, even when they signed him, thought that he was going to be the next Tim Duncan, like this centerpiece of future championships. He was just an all-star caliber guy to add to a good team. And that kind of, like you said, unraveled around him. Jeff was talking about
it's a little bit of a sidetrack, but remember we used to do that like Spurs roundtable for the paper, and one of the questions when they signed LaMarcus that summer that we were offered as a roundtable was, who's going to lead the Spurs in scoring this first season that LaMarcus Aldridge is here, and it was pretty unanimously LaMarcus Aldridge and not Kawhi Leonard. Like it was that's where those two players were at that time. LaMarcus was, a scoring star, and Kawhi had not quite got there yet. And it turned out to be Kawhi by a country mile. But that was the perception at the time, was that LaMarcus was here to be the lead dog. That was part of the reason he was leaving Portland, was he couldn't be the lead dog there. And, come here and Kawhi kind of emerged, took over, became one of the greatest players in the league. It looked like he was going to take them to a finals, and LaMarcus was going to get to the finals and possibly win a championship anyway. And then, we all know the history of Jaja Pachulia in that series, and the Spurs haven't been the same since because Kawhi left.
Yeah, he had that one season, 2017-18, when they lost to Golden State in the first round. He averaged 23.1 points that year, and that was more what he had envisioned. But it just boils down to circumstances beyond his control that everything just kind of unraveled.
Right. And when the criticism of him is he's not Tim Duncan, like that's kind of a no kidding type of statement. But you hear that a lot from. And I don't want to condescend to fans. That's Jeff's job. But I think that people who've been watching the Spurs for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, just are accustomed to Hall of Fame, once in a lifetime for other franchises, leaders, elite players all the time. And, that's sort of unrealistic. That's an unrealistic standard to hold somebody like LaMarcus Aldridge to.
Or DeMar DeRozan.
Or DeMar DeRozan, or just name the guy. People get frustrated because they watched Tim Duncan, and to a lesser extent Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker and David Robinson and George Gervin. They were good most every night, and a lot of really good players have their off nights. And people say, DeMar, he was great 5 games in a row, but where was he tonight? What happened to him tonight? Well, that's what happens to really good players. They have their bad nights.
At one
LaMarcus
time,
had plenty of those too.
And so that Walter Berry, he's no George Gervin,
right? Captain Late, did Captain Late ever get criticism?
Only early. What if this is the twist? What if the next Tim Duncan is actually Jakob Poeltl?
Yeah. This bit could be the future of the podcast.
It's not a bit. I mean, that part is. But Jakob Poeltl's a fantastic basketball player.
This could be part of the reviews that people post that we love, by the way. We really appreciate it. In all seriousness, it helps us if you rate and review the podcast. And if you've made it this far, again, why would it not be a positive review? I'm not a fan of
these reviews. I just want to put that on the record. I wish people would stop.
I think they're wonderful. They're good to help the podcast grow.
Everybody hates me.
I think the more that you rate us highly while also bashing Jeff, like that's great for the podcast. So do that on your podcast app. Go to expressnews.com, which is continuing to provide Spurs coverage and coverage of this weather and this stuff that everybody's dealing with in the community these days. It's great help to go to expressnews.com, subscribe to the Spurs Nation newsletter, to all the newsletters for all your local news. Jeff loves Jakob Poeltl. I think that's great. I think it's great that the Spurs will eventually get back onto the floor after this is over with. We hope that this bout with COVID is fleeting, and that they can move on beyond this, and that no one gets seriously sick. And we hope that the next podcast, when we talk to all of you from the secure locations, that we'll be talking more about basketball and about games that are about to happen. Until then, we ask that you take care of each other and to keep it real.